The world in the 1914s to 1918s was a very violent time, and with violence comes weapons and new technologies.
For most of the war, Canada did not fight as its own country, as it was part of the British Empire. Canadians were not forced to enlist in the war though, unlike many other countries such as Germany and Russia. Canada had about 620,000 enlistments in the war, and with all those people to fight came a lot of gear and death. Nearly 60,000 deaths to be exact, just for Canada alone, one of Canada's biggest conflicts.
The common foot soldier was given helmets, a gas mask hood, sometimes a small box respirator, a cold weather suit for cold temperatures, a canteen, a hat or cap, a duffel bag, and identity discs.
Canada did not have much of an army going into the war. In fact, Canada was not a military nation before 1914. Canada only had 2 small ships and 3,110 regular members in the Navy, and the Navy was very new at the time. The Navy was only made 4 years before the war in 1910. The first 2 ships were old ships used by Britain that Canada had bought. It was the HMS Niobe and the HMCS Rainbow. Both were 15 years or older, making them very outdated for the time.
The Rainbow was only in commission for 10 years when it was in Canada. War at sea was a key component for Canada, as it was nowhere near the war and had to use the sea to actually transport weapons and troops.
What Canada originally did was take old yachts and turn them into patrol boats. German U-boats would come and shoot down many Canadian fishers and other boats, so they always had to be on guard. The first Canadian battleships were surprisingly submarines, and they were made in the USA. Canada did not have much destroyers though, they only had 2. These 2 were in the M class, making them about average compared to other boats. These boats were the HMCS Patriot and the HMCS Patrician.
Most of Canada's navy were minesweepers, and minesweepers were used to look for mines that were put across the coast. These boats are usually very small and wooden with a low fuel capacity. The second most used ship is the naval drifters. These are used to patrol areas usually. The third most used ship is the naval trawlers. These are used to patrol Canada even though they are battle classed. There were 12 of these made by the end of the war, and all of them were battle class ships.
Then it goes to the cruiser, which are used to hunt enemy ships, also used as convoy, and lastly, can also be used for deterrence. The common Canadian soldier was equipped with the Ross rifle, and they were trained to shoot in fast succession. The Ross rifle was a Canadian-made gun that was made as an alternate rifle for the British Lee Enfield.
Although the Ross rifle was excellent for sharp shooting, it was not robust enough for regular use in the trenches. Also, soldiers soon discovered that the Ross was not suited for dirty trench warfare, and that it earned a bad reputation among Canadian soldiers as an unreliable weapon. Many of the artillery used by Canada had sharp fragments of shrapnel in them, and later in the war they would shoot gas and smoke shells. There were mortars and field guns. This is the 18-pounder field gun, and it could fire explosive shells that had shrapnel in them. The field gun was lighter, had a smaller caliber shell, and was easier to transport. Because of this, they could be used more offensively and used to attack the enemy trench head-on, while mortars had to fire from a distance. Mortars were used to dislodge the enemy from the trenches, which would then make the area weak. The 18-pounder was used to shoot trenches from up close, and also to hit airplanes out of the air. Britain had 2 main mortars in World War I. One was lighter and more portable, and the other was a big, higher caliber mortar. The smaller caliber mortar was called the Strokes mortar, and the bigger mortar was called the 9.45-inch heavy mortar. First, the Strokes mortar.
The Strokes mortar was used for high angles of fire, and it had a bore of 3.2 inches. The max range was 800 yards, and the British Army had 1,636 in service in the war.
The 9.45-inch heavy mortar was a modification of a French design. It required 4 carts to transfer the whole mortar when it needed to be moved.
Artillery was a big part in World War I, and they were made to launch explosives large distances. There is light and heavy artillery. Light artillery is usually used in field battles and were needed to be more mobile. Large artillery is used to shoot longer ranges and shoot higher caliber shots. One example of large artillery is the Ordnance BL 9.2 inch, which had a maximum range of 10 miles. It required a crew of 15 and there was 16 in production. The filling itself was 40 pounds and it was first used in 1914, and in 1915 they started to make more.
There were also artillery that was used as anti-aircraft cannons that had multiple barrels so they could have a wider spread, making it easier to hit the planes. One example of this is the Ordnance QF 2-pounder, which required a range of 2 miles and required 5 people to operate it. Artillery was excellent for applying pressure on the enemy, as it could be fired from a long distance. This was crucial for a war that was being fought by inches, as one small sign of weakness and you could be attacked. Canada's era of gas warfare has left an introduction of suffering, secrecy, and ambiguity. However, the introduction had increased effective gas masks and other precautions to help counter the chemical weapon.
Poison gas was providing 3 substances that were responsible for most chemical weapon injuries and deaths during World War I: chlorine, phosgene, and mustard gas, all of them being extremely lethal and deadly. This had led to a gas warfare, which is a method of war that employs weapons to cause casualties, particularly through the use of harmful chemical agents.
Although poison gas was a very effective weapon for chemical weapons, the methods of deployment began to change over time. Systems were beginning to become less dependent on wind direction. Most of the poison gas after was delivered by artillery and mortar rounds. Planes were not very advanced in World War I due to the technology for it being very new. They were forced to drop bricks from the sky to strike people on the ground, and the average life expectancy of a pilot was only a few weeks.
However, they eventually became better with faster speeds and being more maneuverable. Canada did not have its own air force for most of the war, so Canadians who wanted to fly went to Britain to join their air force.
However, by 1918, 40% of the British Air Force pilots were Canadian. Canadians were beginning to have a bigger role in Air Force. Tanks were a major advantage in World War I, as the defender would always have a great advantage, and the tank helped to make attacks more successful by going over barbed wires, which was a big and hard task for soldiers going over trenches, which was also a hard thing for normal soldiers as they were exposed to fire from the riflemen and the machine gun fire that the defender would be able to use. All tanks were given a specific name such as naval vessels, and sometimes what they did was to take a dummy tank and use it as a decoy for the enemy to shoot at it. Only 8 tanks could support in the Battle of Vimy Ridge due to the lack of tanks Canada had during the war, due to it being such a new technology. Allied tanks became faster and more reliable than enemy tanks, but they still were not to the point where if you had a tank, you would have won the battle.
The Germans had made a tank trap that was used to make sure that tanks could not get over certain walls. It was a concrete wall with steel rods coming up from it so that the tank could not get over the top. This made the defense of the Germans weak to infantry but strong to tanks. One tank used by Britain was the British Mk1 tank. This tank had the steering cage at the back and had 2 6-pound guns at the side. The design was later changed due to vulnerability it had to shell fire. This tank was very slow and was prone to mechanical breakdown. It was useful for going over barbed wire and getting over trenches, as they had made it to be. The Canadian Army first used modern flame weapons during the First World War. The base purpose of a flamethrower is to spread fire by launching burning fuel. Flamethrowers in World War I were often an unpredictable weapon that could explode, burning fuel on the user.
Flamethrowers were also very terrifying. The moral effect was towards people's fear of fire and being burned. This could sometimes cause poorly trained troops to panic.
The soldiers using these weapons had very dangerous jobs. Flamethrowers were often an unpredictable and dangerous weapon that was very destructive at close range but ineffective at long ranges.
The flamethrower had ultimately developed throughout World War I. They can be vehicle mounted as on a tank or portable. They were incredibly effective in jungle warfare for destroying the enemy.
During the events of Vimy Ridge, the Canadians had planned to provide greater flexibility and firepower in battle. The flamethrower had played a significant role that was given to infantry in order to seize the Vimy Ridge. Grenades were widely used in World War I. It would be common for anyone in a trench to be killed in battle quickly, since grenades assisted soldiers to attack without physically being around the opposing soldiers.
The grenade, which was typically known as a bomb during the war, was mainly used for its effectiveness during trench warfare. However, it left a high number of NPTs. Grenades could possibly explode on the soldier holding it if not thrown in time or properly. Other locations were not heavily relied on by grenades.
This is the number 1 Mk5 hand grenade, and it was widely used by Canadian and British troops in World War I. It was also known as a Mills bomb, and it was one of the most effective infantry weapons. It was first issued to troops in the spring of 1915, and after pulling the safety pin, the user had 5 seconds before the grenade exploded. The grenade had a lethal range of 10 meters, and the explosion sent metal pieces up to 200 meters away.
At first, machine guns were only used for defensive means, as they were very effective for this cause. The machine gun ultimately made trench warfare happen, as it forced soldiers to have to dig cover to avoid the shots of these weapons from the defender. It also ultimately later changed the battle formation of armies, as they had to change from their old stiff and clumped up formations to a more loose, widespread formation. There were only 4 machine guns in every infantry battalion, and in the early stages of the war, the machine gun used by Canada was the Colt machine gun. It was very susceptible to jamming, so later on Canada replaced it with the Vickers machine gun. The Colt was not a new weapon, as it was used before 10 years prior to the war. They had a very high fire rate, approximately 400 to 500 bullets per minute. The Vickers was a water-cooled machine gun that Canada started to use after 1916. The gun was also used for attack, but it needed constant attention, and the proper amount of ammo and water was needed. Over time, more and more technology came out for this weapon, such as the clinometer. The clinometer helped find the angle of the sloping ground, which made it easier for soldiers to shoot more accurately.